All right, so you guys wanted to hear about what's going on in Ghana, and
Yeah.
that's what we're going to deep dive into today. Um, we've got two really interesting speeches to dig into. One is President John Dramani Mahama's 2025 inaugural address. This is actually his second non-consecutive term,
Right.
which is pretty unusual.
Yeah.
And then we've also got a speech from the Nigerian president, who was a special guest of honor at the inauguration. So what are we hoping to learn from these speeches today?
Well, I think for me, it would be interesting to see what we can glean about the direction Ghana's headed. What are the key messages coming out of these speeches?
Right, because there's a lot going on in Ghana. But why should people care? Even if they aren't directly involved with Ghana. Why is this deep dive relevant to them?
I think there are a lot of reasons, actually. You've got
Hmm.
the whole theme of democratic transitions. We're also looking at economic challenges. And then there's the question of how Ghana fits into this changing global landscape.
Yeah.
So those are all issues that have implications far beyond Ghana's borders.
Absolutely. Okay, so let's jump right into it. This whole thing about Ghana's déjà vu democracy. I mean, it's pretty striking when you think about it. Mahama and the outgoing president Akufo-Addo, they've basically been switching places every few years since 2017. They hand the presidency back and forth.
Mm.
What's your take on this whole back and forth?
Well, you have to wonder what the long-term implications of this might be. I mean, on one hand, it could be seen as a sign of stability in Ghana's democracy.
Right.
The system is working, transitions are happening peacefully. But then you have to ask, is this political ping pong actually hindering progress in a way? Is it preventing new ideas, real change?
It makes you wonder if we'll see anything different this time around, or just more of the same. Especially since these two, Mahama and Akufo-Addo, they entered parliament at the same time back in '96. So there's a long history there, a real rivalry.
Yes, and I think that shared history adds another layer of complexity to the situation. Does their personal history influence policy decisions? Does it prevent them from taking truly innovative approaches? Those are important questions to consider.
Okay, so moving on. Let's talk about Mahama's take on Ghana's place in the world. He talks about this geopolitical maelstrom, which is a pretty vivid description. And he specifically calls out the tension between the G7 and the BRICS nations. What implications does this global power shift have for Ghana?
Right. Well, it's important to remember that Ghana's in a delicate position. They're trying to attract investment and stimulate growth. They want to be a leader in the region. But this changing dynamic between the G7 and BRICS, it creates both opportunity and risk for them.
Right, because aligning too closely with one side could alienate potential partners on the other.
Exactly. So Ghana has to walk this tightrope. They need to figure out how to leverage the strengths of both the G7 and BRICS without becoming overly dependent on either one. And they have to do it while navigating a web of existing alliances and historical relationships. It's a tough spot to be in.
Sounds like a real balancing act.
Oh, it is. And then on top of that, you've got the technological dimension. Mahama talks about artificial intelligence, social media manipulation. These are issues that are increasingly shaping global politics. And they're going to have an impact on Ghana, too.
Yeah, that really jumped out at me. It felt like a warning. Like he's saying, hey, this isn't just some far-off tech problem. This is going to directly impact Ghana, too.
Yes, and it highlights the need for regional cooperation. He talks about how interconnected Ghana's fate is with its neighbors. They're facing a lot of the same threats.
He actually uses this great phrase. He says, we are all part of one another, one big family.
I like that. It suggests a shift in thinking away from this every nation for itself mentality and towards a more collaborative approach to facing shared challenges.
Okay, so now let's dig into this whole reset concept that Mahama keeps coming back to.
Mhm.
What exactly does he mean by reset? What's changing?
Well, I think it's partly a recognition that the old ways of doing things aren't working. He's very upfront about the economic hardships Ghanaians are facing, and he acknowledges the sense that maybe democracy hasn't delivered for everyone.
Yeah, he doesn't sugarcoat the dire circumstances at all.
He doesn't. But in that stark assessment, there's also a thread of hope. He seems to believe that things can be turned around, and that's where the reset comes in. It's about restoring faith in institutions, tackling corruption head-on, and creating a more equitable society for all Ghanaians.
He actually lays out 4 specific areas he plans to focus on. Economic restoration is a big one, of course.
Yes, and within that, he emphasizes the need for macroeconomic stability, so controlling inflation, managing debt, creating an environment where businesses can thrive.
He also talks about improving the business environment. What does that actually look like on the ground?
Well, it seems like he wants to streamline regulations, reduce bureaucracy, make it easier for businesses to operate. He talks about leveling the playing field.
Which I imagine is meant to address concerns about cronyism and favoritism, which have been problems in the past.
Yes, it seems he's signaling a move towards a more meritocratic system, which could be huge for Ghana's economy, attract foreign investment, foster genuine competition, lead to more innovation and prosperity.
And then there's governance reform, which is probably a long-term project.
Definitely. It's about strengthening institutions, promoting accountability, making sure that the government is serving the people, and of course, he's also going to be focusing on anti-corruption efforts.
Which, let's face it, is a monumental task.
It is, but it's also essential if he wants to build that truly just and equitable society he talks about.
All right, so we've got macroeconomic stability, a better business environment, governance reforms, and then there's this big idea that takes up a lot of his speech, the 24-hour economy. What's the thinking behind that?
It's a bold idea. He's basically proposing a fundamental shift in how Ghana operates. He wants to leverage their strengths in agriculture, create public services that are available 24/7, and foster a business environment that never sleeps.
It almost sounds like he's trying to create a mini Singapore. But how is he actually going to make this happen? What are the concrete steps?
That's what we'll look into in the next part of our deep dive. We'll examine the specifics of his plan, the potential benefits, the challenges, and think about whether this vision is actually feasible.
So before the break, we were talking about those 4 areas Mahama's focusing on. And one thing I noticed was that he actually lays out specific actions he wants to take, like right away in his first 120 days in office. It's like he's making a contract with the Ghanaian people.
Oh, yeah, I noticed that too. He actually calls it a covenant with the people, which I thought was interesting.
Yeah, that's a much stronger word than just like a plan or something.
It is. It implies a much deeper level of commitment, almost like a sacred promise.
Right. It's not just campaign promises. It's like he's saying, I'm going to deliver on this and I'm giving you a timeline.
Exactly.
And he doesn't shy away from the tough stuff either. I mean, he really gets into the economic situation. He talks about how Ghana's debt has become unsustainable, how it's really putting a strain on the economy.
I think it's refreshing to see a leader being so upfront about the challenges, you know? It actually builds trust, even if the news isn't good.
Totally. It's like he's acknowledging the elephant in the room.
Yeah.
And then the question is, how does he plan to fix it? He mentions restoring macroeconomic stability, but what does that even mean?
Well, it sounds very broad, but it basically means getting the fundamentals right, getting inflation under control, stabilizing the currency, creating a predictable economic environment.
So basically getting the house in order before you can start redecorating.
Yeah, I like that analogy.
So that all makes sense.
Yeah.
But then how does this tie into his bigger plans, like this whole 24-hour economy thing?
Well, he makes it pretty clear that he sees macroeconomic stability as essential for achieving that vision. He argues that you can't build a dynamic, competitive economy without a solid foundation.
Okay, so you've got to fix the roof before you can start building a new house.
Exactly. And then when it comes to improving the business environment, what I found really interesting was his focus on leveling the playing field.
Okay.
So it's not just about reducing red tape and streamlining regulations. It's also about making sure that everyone has a fair shot.
So tackling those issues of cronyism and favoritism that we've seen in the past.
Exactly. It sounds like he's pushing for a more meritocratic system, which I think could be a really positive development for Ghana. It could attract more foreign investment, encourage healthy competition, and ultimately lead to more innovation and prosperity for everyone.
Right. And that ties into his plans for governance reform as well.
Absolutely. It's all connected. He wants to strengthen institutions, make the government more accountable, and ensure that it's truly serving the people.
It's a pretty ambitious agenda, though. You have to wonder how much resistance he'll face.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, anytime you try to change the system, there are going to be people who benefit from the way things are, and they're not going to give up their power easily.
Yeah, for sure. So it'll be interesting to see how he navigates those political complexities. Can he actually get these reforms passed?
Right. And can he resist the pressure from those who want to maintain the status quo? Those are big questions.
Okay, so we've talked about the need for macroeconomic stability, a better business environment, and these governance reforms. But let's get back to this 24-hour economy plan. Does he actually lay out any specifics about how that's going to work?
He does. He highlights a few key pillars, and one of the biggest is leveraging agriculture and agribusiness. He talks about investing in modern farming techniques, improving storage and transportation infrastructure, and creating value-added industries.
So basically taking what Ghana already does well and making it even better.
Right, scaling it up, making it more competitive on a global level. And he sees this as a major driver of job creation, especially for young people.
Okay, and then he links that to the need for responsive public services. So it's not just about businesses operating 24/7. It's about having the infrastructure to support that.
Exactly. He talks about reliable electricity, efficient transportation, accessible healthcare, all available around the clock. It's about creating a whole ecosystem that supports this new way of life.
It's a very compelling vision, but I have to ask, is it actually realistic?
Hmm?
Can Ghana really pull off something this ambitious?
Well, that's the big question, isn't it? There are definitely potential roadblocks. For example, infrastructure is a huge challenge. They would need to make massive investments in their electricity grid, transportation networks, communication systems.
And then there's the question of funding all of this,
Yeah.
which isn't going to be easy given their current debt situation.
No, absolutely. But he does talk about attracting foreign investment and using public funds more efficiently, so he seems to be aware of the financial constraints, at least.
What about security? I mean, a 24-hour economy would need to be a safe environment for everyone.
That's another key factor. He talks about strengthening law enforcement, improving crime prevention. But again, these are long-term projects that require sustained effort and community buy-in.
It's not just about physical infrastructure and security either, right? They're also going to need a skilled workforce that can adapt to this 24-hour model.
Right, and he does acknowledge that. He talks about investing in education and vocational training programs that are specifically tailored to the demands of a 24-hour economy.
So making sure people have the skills they need to thrive in this new system.
Exactly. It's about equipping the workforce for the future.
And all of that makes sense. But one thing I was wondering about is, are there any potential social or cultural implications of shifting to a 24-hour society? Like, that could have a pretty big impact on people's lives.
You're right. That's a really important consideration. And to be honest, it's not something that was explicitly addressed in the speeches we're looking at.
Interesting.
It's definitely an area where more research and discussion is needed. Because you're right, this kind of change could disrupt traditional patterns of life, work-life balance, even social interactions.
It's almost like he's presenting this very bold economic vision without really grappling with the potential social consequences.
I think that's a fair assessment. And it's something that Ghanaians themselves would need to debate and decide on. Is this the kind of future they want? Are the economic benefits worth the potential social or cultural trade-offs?
So we've talked about the potential roadblocks funding infrastructure security, the skills gap, and these unaddressed social and cultural implications. Do you think it's actually feasible, or is this whole thing just a pipe dream?
It's tough to say. I think it's important to acknowledge just how ambitious this vision is. It's truly transformative, and as with any grand endeavor, there are inherent risks. But I wouldn't dismiss it as a pipe dream just yet. What's crucial is that they acknowledge and address these challenges head-on.
So a healthy dose of skepticism is warranted.
Absolutely. But skepticism shouldn't be a barrier to innovation.
It's all about finding that balance,
Right.
being cautiously optimistic, but also realistic about the potential pitfalls.
Exactly. And that's what makes this whole thing so fascinating. It's not a simple yes or no answer. It's a complex issue with lots of different factors to consider.
Okay, so we've delved into the details of Mahama's plan for his first 120 days. But his inaugural address wasn't all about domestic policy. He also touched on some pretty major global issues like healthcare and climate change.
Yeah, and I think that's a good place to pick up after the break. We can explore how he positions Ghana in the context of these global challenges. And we can take another look at the Nigerian president's speech and what it tells us about the relationship between these two key players in West Africa.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of Mahama's domestic agenda, his reset plan, his vision for a 24-hour economy. But he also talked about some global stuff, especially public health.
Right, and I
Yeah.
think it's interesting how he tied the whole idea of future pandemics to climate change. You don't hear that connection made very often.
Yeah, it's pretty sobering when you think about it. It's like we tend to think of those as separate issues. But he's saying that they're actually really connected.
Yeah. He's saying climate change isn't just an environmental problem, it's a public health problem too. It makes everything worse. Makes it easier for diseases to spread.
And that's where I think his emphasis on regional cooperation is so important, because pandemics don't stop at borders, right?
Exactly. He's pushing for a more coordinated approach to global health. Stronger healthcare systems across the whole region, better communication, sharing information, coordinating responses to outbreaks.
And he's calling for more investment in public health infrastructure, which we know has been a problem in a lot of places.
Yeah. It's like he's saying healthcare isn't just about social welfare, it's about national security.
Which makes sense if you think about how much a pandemic can disrupt everything, the economy, society. So it's not just about treating people when they're sick. It's about preventing those outbreaks from happening in the first place.
Right. It's about building resilience.
Okay, so let's talk about climate change specifically for a minute.
Yeah.
How does Mahama address this issue? Because it's obviously having a big impact on a lot of African countries.
He acknowledges that Ghana's already feeling the effects: droughts, floods, coastal erosion. And he frames it as a threat to everything: economic development, food security, even national stability.
So again, he's connecting those dots, showing how climate change has these ripple effects.
Exactly. And he's not afraid to call for action, both at home and internationally.
What kind of action is he talking about?
Well, in Ghana, he talks about transitioning to a low-carbon economy, investing in renewable energy, promoting sustainable agriculture, reducing emissions.
And globally.
He stresses the importance of international cooperation, calling on developed countries to step up and fulfill their commitments to provide climate finance.
So he's advocating for a more equitable approach to dealing with climate change, recognizing that the countries who caused the problem have a responsibility to help those who are suffering the most from it.
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment.
Yeah.
He's pushing for climate justice, saying that the countries that benefited from industrialization have a moral obligation to help those who are paying the price now.
Okay, so we've talked about Mahama's vision for a reset in Ghana, his focus on global issues like healthcare and climate change. But let's go back to the Nigerian president's speech for a minute. You mentioned earlier that his presence at the inauguration was pretty significant.
Yeah, it really shows how important the relationship between Ghana and Nigeria is. They're two of the biggest players in West Africa, and their cooperation is really key for stability and economic growth in the region.
What stood out to you about what he had to say?
Well, I noticed that he used a lot of Pan-Africanist language. He talked about a black star rising high in the African sky.
Oh, yeah, I remember that line. It was very powerful.
It was. And it really speaks to this idea of shared destiny among African nations, this belief that they can achieve great things by working together. He's calling for greater unity and solidarity.
Did he mention any specific areas where he sees potential for collaboration between Ghana and Nigeria?
Yeah, he specifically talked about tackling poverty, addressing youth unemployment, promoting peace and security in the region. He also wants to see closer economic ties. He thinks that by working together, Ghana and Nigeria can really become a driving force for development in Africa.
So it's like his message is really building on what Mahama said about regional cooperation,
Right.
but taking it to an even broader level, this idea of Pan-African unity.
Exactly. And I think when you look at both speeches together, you really see this potential for a more integrated and prosperous Africa. It's a vision that's exciting, but also really complex.
Yeah, it does feel like we're seeing a turning point in Ghana. And maybe in Africa as a whole. Mahama's call for change, his big plans for Ghana, his focus on global issues, and then this push for Pan-African unity, it all adds up to something pretty significant.
It does. And it's going to be interesting to see how it all plays out. Can Mahama keep his promises? Will Ghana and Nigeria actually work together and make a difference? Only time will tell.
But I think the takeaway for our listeners today is this. Pay attention to what's happening in Ghana. It's a microcosm of everything that's going on in the developing world. And it's a story that could really change how we see Africa's role in the world.
I think that's a great point. We've looked at the challenges, the ambitions, the uncertainties. And I think it's clear that this story is far from over.
And on that note, I want to thank you all for joining us for this deep dive. We'll be back soon with more fascinating conversations about the events shaping our world.
See you next time.